In this video, you're going to learn something that, if you apply it with precision, she will choose you, not out of love, but because she won't be able to avoid it. Because a woman never chooses the man who loves her. She chooses the man who appears in control, the one who masters silence, the one who doesn't need to be chosen to feel valuable. Love is not an act of giving, it is a silent negotiation of power. And in that negotiation, the one who seems to need the least is always the one who gains the most. Machiavelli understood this centuries before you were born. Desire doesn't come from tenderness, it comes from mystery. It doesn't grow from kindness, but from the perception of dominance. Human beings bow before those who radiate control, and she, though she'll never say it, only feels safe when she senses that the man in front of her could lose her and still remain unshaken. Most men believe that showing love is enough, that being consistent, sweet, or available is the path. But that doesn't awaken desire, it awakens pity. Desire does not seek shelter, it seeks impact. And impact is born from the balance between power and distance. That is why she feels drawn to the man who doesn't beg, doesn't plead, doesn't try to convince her, because his presence alone communicates a quiet truth. I don't need you to choose me to know who I am. And in that moment, the balance shifts. Attraction flips. Her mind begins to chase what her soul fears, a man who can lose her and still remain at peace. This is how female choice actually works. It's not emotional, it's instinctive. And instinct always chooses the one who transmits power. If you understand this, if you apply what you're about to learn, you will never have to chase a woman again. Because when a man learns to master his energy, the entire world begins to shift in his favor. Do you feel that tension? That's power trying to awaken inside you. Tell me where you're watching from, because this is the kind of knowledge no one teaches you, but it can change everything. Machiavelli observed the human heart with the same precision with which a strategist studies the battlefield before a war. He knew that men don't lose because they are weak, they lose because they ignore the nature of their own strength. And in the war of desire, the quietest of all wars, the modern man was falling with greater ease every day, surrendering to his need to be loved. It wasn't love that destroyed him, but the anxiety of needing to feel chosen. That dependence, for Machiavelli, was the symptom of a soul that had forgotten how to govern itself. A man who doesn't control his desire becomes a servant to it. He seeks approval, confuses affection with validation, and offers his energy as tribute to a power he doesn't understand. When she looks at him, she doesn't see a partner, she sees a subordinate. And human nature, ruled by the instinct of hierarchy, does not bow to the one who crawls. She may pretend tenderness, she may smile, but inside her mind, something switches off. Attraction doesn't die from boredom, it dies from the loss of respect, and without respect, no desire survives. Machiavelli would have said that power is born from the perception of control. In politics, the prince had to appear strong even when he feared. In love, a man had to appear calm even when he desired. Because control is not the absence of emotion, but its mastery. The fire still burns, but inside a temple of stone. That is what fascinates a woman. Not the servile gestures of a man seeking approval, but the dangerous calm of a man who could love, yet chooses when to do so. The man without control constantly chases for signs. Does she love me? Is she thinking about me? Why isn't she replying? Every question is a confession of dependence. Every attempt to please her is a surrender of his own power. She senses it instantly, even without analyzing it. Her instinct reacts. Desire doesn't fade because she changes. It fades because he surrendered before he was ever desired. What should have been a dance of power becomes emotional begging. And begging has never been attractive. Compassion does not awaken desire. Constant vulnerability destroys it. Machiavelli saw the same dynamic in the courts of princes. The servant who tries too hard to please sparks suspicion. The ruler who justifies himself loses authority, and the man who seeks to be understood excessively reveals his need. And need always smells like weakness. A woman doesn't choose through logic, she chooses through instinct. And instinct seeks security, but security cannot be requested. It must be radiated. Only a man who governs himself inspires trust. That is why control is not repression, it is inner government. It means knowing your own impulses and choosing what to reveal and what to keep reserved. The controlled man is not cold, he is selective. He doesn't give his attention as charity. He knows every glance, every word carries weight. When he speaks slowly, like a man who does not fear silence, because silence for him is not emptiness. It is conquered territory. The weak fill silence with words, the strong inhabit it. She, standing before this kind of man, feels something different. She can't name it, but she recognizes it. An energy that does not ask, does not bow, does not try to convince. And that mystery activates her most primitive instinct. The mind looks for reasons, the body looks for dominance. And dominance always belongs to the one who needs the least. That is the paradox of desire. The more you control it, the more you awaken it in the other. The modern man has forgotten this. He has been taught to confuse sensitivity with his mission and empathy with self-sacrifice. He gives himself before he is desired. He exposes himself before he is understood. He becomes emotionally naked before a woman who still looks at him from a distance. And by doing so, he destroys the balance of power. The woman feels she owns him before she ever loves him. And what is owned without effort is never valued. Machiavelli would look at him with disdain, a prince abandoning his emotional throne before the coronation. Because the throne in love is not earned through insistence, but through presence. A man who knows who he is doesn't run after anyone, because he understands that real desire is born from recognition, not from pursuit. If she distances herself, he observes. If she tests her power, he smiles. Not because he is indifferent, but because he knows that the one who reacts first loses command. In that command lies real attraction. It is not about manipulating the other, but about mastering your own chaos. He who controls his energy controls his environment, and he who controls his environment inspires desire. She will not choose him for his words or his promises, but for the dangerous calm he radiates, the calm of a man who does not need, who can love without losing himself. If men understood this, they would stop chasing and start attracting. They would stop begging for attention and begin generating respect. Because respect is the root of every lasting desire. The temporary burns with passion, the inevitable is built with power. And power is never obtained by asking. It is cultivated in silence, in the mind, in the way a man breathes when facing uncertainty. Every time a man masters his impulse to react, he gains ground. Every time he resists the urge to prove something, his value rises. Every time he chooses to observe instead of respond, he becomes a mystery. And mystery, in the nature of desire, is pure power. She may not understand it consciously, but her instinct feels it. She cannot explain it, but something in him makes her hesitate. Something in his calm challenges her, and where there is challenge, there is attraction. Control, then, is not an act. It is a form of self-respect. Machiavelli would say, "He who does not govern his emotions will be governed by them." And in love, that means being governed by someone else's desire. That is why the man who masters his anxiety becomes the sovereign of his own story. His life no longer revolves around being chosen, it revolves around choosing. That inversion of power changes everything. When a man reaches that state, his energy shifts. His eyes do not search, they observe. His voice does not plead, it asserts. His gestures do not try to convince, they simply express presence, and in that presence, everything rearranges. She feels she is standing before someone she cannot possess easily, someone who does not bow to the common game. And that difficulty awakens respect, and from respect, real desire is born. Because she does not want the man who gives himself without limits. She wants the man who sets limits with elegance, the man who can love her without losing himself. And that kind of man only appears when control stops being a mask and becomes a natural state. It is not coldness, it is balance, not distance, but courage, not manipulation, but awareness. And that awareness is what separates the man from the boy, the prince from the servant, desire from attachment. When a man understands this, he no longer needs to conquer. His presence alone conquers, not because he performs, but because he exists with purpose. And that existence carries a weight that can be felt without words. Power is not in what he does, but in what he no longer needs to do. You feel it too. That calmness, the one that appears when you stop chasing and start governing yourself. If something in you resonated with this, look at your own reflection and comment where you're watching from. Because a man who understands this truth is already closer to mastering himself than being mastered. Machiavelli observed, with quiet precision, how a woman's gaze changed the moment a man no longer needed her. It wasn't something visible at first glance, it was an almost imperceptible tremor, a slight loss of control the feminine mind tried to hide with trivial gestures. Until that moment, she had felt in command. Every word, every gesture from him confirmed her power. But when he began to move with the serenity of a man who does not depend, something cracked in the invisible balance that held her desire. The man's inner control changed the air around him. It wasn't a trick, it was a different vibration. The energy that once begged became presence. The anxiety that once pushed him to seek answers turned into silence. And that silence was dangerous because it contained power. She couldn't explain why, but she found herself thinking of him more often. Her mind sought his attention, not out of need, but out of curiosity. She wanted to understand what had changed, why he no longer felt predictable. Machiavelli would have said that uncertainty is the seed of desire. Human beings long for what they cannot classify and fear losing what they do not understand. This is why, when a man becomes unpredictable, not through manipulation but through mastery, the woman senses something slipping from her control, and instinct, ever loyal to power, begins to turn toward him. Dominion doesn't need demonstrations. A man who knows himself does not react to provocation. He does not justify his silence nor explain his decisions. She feels that something in his energy has become impenetrable, and in the logic of desire, that equals magnetism. The feminine mind can resist appearance, but it cannot resist mystery. As he regains his center, the polarity shifts. What was once pursuit becomes attraction. She begins to adjust to his rhythm, to seek his attention with subtle signals she never used before. And when she does this, it is not affection, it is an attempt to recover balance. Lost power tries to return, but now it cannot return through force, only through recognition. Machiavelli saw this exchange as a dance of shadows. A man who has learned to rule himself does not need to shout his power. His calm is enough. Every word he speaks carries weight, because he is not trying to convince. Every silence he keeps echoes with authority. She starts to notice that she no longer controls the dialogue, that her attempts to provoke a reaction are useless, and the more she fails, the more fascinated she becomes. Desire, Machiavelli believed, is obedient to the one who governs himself. The feminine nature does not seek chaos, it seeks security disguised as mystery. And the deepest form of security is the man who does not collapse when uncertainty appears. Have you ever felt that calmness when you stop needing to be understood? That is the moment the world begins to turn in your favor. If you feel it, stay. This is only the beginning. The change was not just in his outward behavior, but in his inner order. The man who learned to master his emotions now moved as if everything around him was a reflection of his calm. Machiavelli believed that at this point, the battle was already won. He who governs his mind also governs the perception of others. The woman, who once watched him from a distance, began to feel the invisible force of his balance. She didn't know it consciously, but her body responded before her thoughts did. His voice sounded different, not in tone, but in intention. Every word came clean of need. He wasn't trying to impress, he was simply expressing. And in that absence of seeking lay the most powerful form of attraction. What a man does not try to possess becomes valuable, because it transmits freedom. Her desire was awakening again, this time colored with respect. Machiavelli recognized in this the same principle he described for kingdoms. Stable power does not shout, does not threaten, it simply exists. Whatever must be defended loudly is already close to falling. So the man who feels the need to convince a woman of his worth reveals that he still doubts himself. But the man who stands firm in his own certainty inspires trust. And trust, Machiavelli believed, is the most subtle form of domination. She began imagining him even in his absence. His silence became presence. His distance became mystery. She tried to read between the lines, searching for traces of emotion, signs that he still cared, but he no longer played that game. Not because he didn't feel, but because he understood that feeling does not mean surrender. Emotion, when governed, becomes magnetism. Emotion, when overflowing, becomes weakness. Machiavelli would smile at this reversal of forces. The man who once feared losing her was now the one she feared losing. And it wasn't cruelty, it was balance restored. The human mind only respects what it perceives as strong, it only gives itself to what it cannot fully possess. That is why, when a man regains his emotional independence, she does not pull away. She moves closer. Every glance he avoided with elegance was a lesson in power. Every calm response to her provocation built an invisible wall around him. Not a wall of coldness, but a wall of respect. and respect is the most refined form of desire. You cannot love someone you do not respect. You cannot respect someone who crawls. At that point, Machiavelli understood that true seduction is not about manipulating another person's mind, but about governing your own. Inner mastery is contagious. Whoever achieves it changes the atmosphere of every room they enter. She feels more feminine, more alive, more vulnerable in his presence, because she senses she is facing a man who does not need, but chooses. And free choice is the most erotic act that exists. Thus, the game changes forever. He does not chase her, but he receives her. He does not pursue, but he observes. His gaze does not demand, it evaluates. His energy does not beg, it radiates. Every gesture of his feels deliberate, like a king who does not fear losing the throne because he understands the throne is himself. At that moment, Machiavelli believed the man had reached the purest form of power, the self-sufficiency of the soul. And she, who once underestimated him, begins to taste the bitterness of doubt. She wonders at what moment she lost control, when she stopped being the one chosen and began wanting to be chosen again. The power that once belonged to her now surrounds her from him. Her pride resists, but her instinct surrenders, because desire, at its root, does not seek equality, it seeks direction. And the man who rules his inner world always sets the direction. Machiavelli knew this was the oldest law. He who conquers himself needs to conquer no one else. Everything bends before that energy, even love. That is why the lesson is clear. Control is not a technique, it is a reconstructed nature. A man who reaches it never begs again. And in that dangerous calm, she chooses him once more. But this time, without realizing that she is no longer the one choosing. You feel it too. That silent inversion where need disappears and power appears. If this thought resonated in you, remain silent for a moment and observe yourself. That is the beginning of true dominion. Machiavelli understood that all power has a price. The mastery over oneself, which the world calls strength, carries within it an inevitable shadow, distance. The man who has learned to govern his emotions can no longer live the way others do. He has abandoned need, and with it, a certain innocence that once kept him connected to the rest. Absolute control cannot exist without sacrifice. To stop depending, one must learn to let go. And what is abandoned is not always trivial. Sometimes it is what once felt indispensable. Overflowing passion, naive surrender, the illusion of being understood. A man who masters himself stops asking, and in that silence, power is born, but so is the echo of solitude. Machiavelli observed that a strong man begins to walk among others as if he were a different species. He does not seek approval, does not justify himself, does not panic over affection. That calm sets him apart. The crowd respects him, even fears him, but no longer understands him. And the woman who once felt attracted to his mystery may eventually sense in him a height she cannot reach. She desires him, but does not know how to touch him without breaking. Inner mastery becomes an invisible frontier. The man has gained the kingdom of himself, but he has lost a portion of the world's sweetness. He knows that any bond can break, and so he clings less. He knows the instability of desire, and so he trusts only his reason. He lives with a serenity that often looks like coldness. Yet inside him there is fire, kept beneath stone like a sealed temple to which very few have access. Machiavelli saw in this balance the reflection of the true prince, the one who governs his solitude as he governs his power. For power that cannot tolerate solitude becomes dependence, and he who depends will eventually yield. Machiavelli believed that the solitude of power was not punishment, but the natural consequence of clarity. A man who understands the fragility of affection stops building his identity in the eyes of others. And in that detachment, painful as it is, he finds his freedom. Love does not disappear for him, it transforms. It is no longer an exchange of needs, but a recognition between two complete beings. But few reach this state without losing something along the way. Inner mastery demands invisible sacrifices. The serene gaze that impresses the world rests upon ruins no one sees. Every silence hides a renunciation. Every measured gesture comes from a wound that learned not to bleed. The woman who once chose him for his calm eventually discovers that his calm is also a wall. She looks for cracks where doors once existed. She tries to awaken his emotion, as if his control were a lack of love, without realizing that his emotion is still alive, only tamed. The man has not stopped feeling, he has learned to choose when to feel. But for those who live by impulse, this choice resembles coldness, and from there, a new conflict is born. The attraction that was once power can become distance. Machiavelli noted that the highest balance always creates vertigo in those unfamiliar with it. A strong man does not fear losing, because he has already lost himself before. The woman who joins him feels his certainty like a double-edged sword. It protects her, but also makes her aware of her own vulnerability. And the human mind rarely tolerates feeling naked before the serenity of another. Thus, what began as fascination can transform into discomfort, and discomfort into escape. Yet the man who understands the nature of power does not chase. He does not try to keep close anyone who cannot understand his stillness. He knows that whatever truly belongs to him will return, not by destiny, but by gravity. His steady, contained energy acts as an invisible center that attracts without moving. That is the paradox of mastery. The more you release, the more returns what once slipped away. Machiavelli saw in this the perfection of his theory. Power does not lie in possessing, but in being able to lose without breaking. A man who can lose everything and remain intact depends on nothing. And that kind of man, though solitary, lives with a peace others mistake for emptiness. Yet in truth, it is fullness, the fullness of someone who has made peace with his own shadow. From time to time, in his thoughts, that man remembers the old fire of desire. He could ignite it again, but he no longer needs it. Power has taught him that love is an act of choice, not of lack. If he ever loves again, he will do it from abundance, not from emptiness. And that way of loving, Machiavelli believed, is the most feared of all, because it does not promise eternity, only presence. It does not seek possession, but understanding. Do you feel that silent weight in your chest as you read this? It is the echo of your own strength trying to awaken. Comment where you feel it. Recognizing it is the beginning of mastering it. Machiavelli knew that no power is absolute as long as desire exists. Self-mastery may appear firm, but a single look, a familiar voice, a memory brushing the skin is enough to make the balance tremble. The man who believed himself invulnerable discovers then that the fire never goes out. It only hides, waiting for the right moment to test its strength. Temptation does not arrive with noise. It whispers. It returns like a familiar shadow that knows the corridors of his mind. She comes back, not always the same woman, but the same energy. With the precision of someone knocking on a door she knows is not fully closed. Her presence does not disarm him, but it confronts him. It reminds him that control without challenge is only theory. Machiavelli watched him like a strategist studying a general faced with a war he does not wish to fight. The man feels the impulse to advance, the curiosity to test his own mastery. He knows he could lose himself again if he confuses calm with immunity. True strength lies not in repressing desire, but in recognizing it without obeying it, in looking it in the eyes, letting it breathe, and still remaining intact. She senses this. Her instinct recognizes the difference between the man who flees the fire and the one who watches it without burning. That serenity draws her even more. She seeks him, tempts him, not out of malice, but because her nature must test the limits of the power that dominates her. In every word she speaks, there is an echo of the past, a promise of intensity that could pull him back. But the man has changed. He is no longer a servant of desire, but its observer. Every emotion that once overwhelmed him has become information. The fascination he feels does not weaken him, it instructs him. He learns to distinguish between what his mind longs for and what his spirit needs. And in that clarity, his power reaffirms itself. Machiavelli understood that the most dangerous mastery is not the one that defeats enemies, but the one that survives memories. The past is the subtlest trap. It makes us believe we feel love when we are merely feeling nostalgia. Temptation, disguised as opportunity, offers a man the illusion of feeling again. But the man who has tasted his own power knows that nothing rooted in the past can return the control he fought so hard to build. That is why he does not yield, not out of pride, but out of wisdom. He lets temptation speak, lets emotion strike his chest, and watches it leave without fighting. Because fighting would mean admitting it still dominates him. To resist calmly, however, is to prove that power no longer requires proof. Have you ever felt that silent force when you manage to stay firm before what once destroyed you? That is real control. If you recognize it, pay attention to what comes next. Power always demands one final test. The silence after temptation reveals far more than the struggle itself. Machiavelli saw in that moment the truest measure of power, when a man, after resisting, does not feel emptiness but a deeper, purer calm. For many defeat desire, but few survive the silence left by its absence. That silence becomes a mirror. In it, he sees every face that once held him captive. Promises, bodies, glances, small addictions disguised as love. Now, standing before himself, the man understands the battle was never against her, but against his own reflection. Temptation never came to destroy him, it came to remind him that mastery without awareness becomes arrogance, and arrogance without humility destroys kingdoms. Machiavelli recognized that moment as the most fragile point for any prince. When no one can challenge him from the outside, the enemy rises from within. Power disguises itself as certainty. Serenity becomes vanity, and a single crack of complacency can make the castle begin to crumble. This is why the wise man never trusts his own strength blindly. He examines it daily, knowing temptation will return in many forms. Sometimes as a face, sometimes as an idea, sometimes as the simple need to feel important again. She, seeing him distant yet alive, intuits that she has lost control. Yet a part of her feels strangely drawn to his resistance. What cannot be conquered becomes idealized. What cannot be possessed is remembered with greater intensity. Thus, temptation begins to burn in its own fire. The man does not need to reject it. His firm presence alone dissolves the illusion. Machiavelli knew that true power does not destroy, it transforms. A man who has been tested does not despise desire. He understands it. He knows every impulse carries a lesson, and denying it would be denying his humanity. Thus, he smiles when the echo of the past tries to return. He no longer feels fear or nostalgia, only gratitude for having learned to walk alone inside the storm. Then the world begins moving again, and he walks among others with the serenity of a man who has returned from hell and found it empty. Nothing can buy his attention now because his attention has become sacred. He does not fear love, but he no longer seeks it. If it comes, he receives it without kneeling. If it leaves, he will not try to hold it. He has discovered that power is not imposing on others, but maintaining inner peace, even in the presence of desire. Machiavelli watched this scene as one watches the final chapter of a treaty completed. The man, tested by temptation, no longer needed to prove anything. He understood that all mastery has a price, but the highest price is losing oneself, and that he would never pay again. Do you feel that quiet after recognizing your strength? Do not mistake it for coldness. It is the exact point where the soul rests and power becomes wisdom. If this thought touched you, say it. Recognizing the moment when temptation surrenders is understanding that control was always inside you. Machiavelli believed that once power is understood, it stops being an act of force and becomes a form of wisdom. A man who has walked through temptation and has not fallen no longer seeks to dominate. He seeks to understand. He discovers that control is not a wall, but a door. That mastery is not coldness, but clarity. After so many inner battles, the man finally realizes that his enemy was never desire, nor the woman, nor the world, but his own blindness. The blindness of believing that power must be proven. Power cannot be proven. It can only be expressed in silence. He who needs to demonstrate control has not yet achieved it. Only when a man can look at the world without demanding anything from it does power transform into something deeper, understanding. Machiavelli watched how this change altered everything it touched. The man who once walked with the stiffness of dominance now moved with the softness of balance. He no longer needed to speak of his strength. His presence alone communicated serenity. People listened to him without knowing why. The woman who once feared his distance now felt peace beside him. Because true authority does not intimidate. It harmonizes. Power transformed into wisdom beats with a different rhythm. It no longer seeks to impose or conquer, it seeks to order. The man begins to see the suffering of others without judgment because he has known his own. He understands that everyone, even the strong, carries invisible battles, and from this understanding emerges a different kind of influence, one that does not manipulate but inspires. Machiavelli would have smiled at this discovery because he knew that the greatest prince is not the one who rules through fear, but the one who leads through respect. Fear governs bodies, respect governs souls. The man who rules his mind no longer needs to impose himself. He becomes a mirror for others. And those around him, seeing themselves reflected in that calm, feel that they too could reach it. Power then stops being possession and becomes a silent service. The strong man is no longer fed by recognition, but by the certainty of his own equilibrium. He knows that the energy he radiates can transform others without intention, like fire warming without trying. This is the highest point of mastery, when control dissolves into understanding and power becomes compassion. A man who has reached this realization no longer fears solitude. He knows it is not punishment, but space. The stillness that once felt like a prison has become his sacred territory, the place where he hears, without noise, the voice that always belonged to him. Machiavelli saw in that serenity the sign of true greatness. He who needs no witnesses to feel complete has defeated the tyranny of external eyes. When she meets him again, she senses something different. It is not the tension of desire, nor the distance of pride. It is the presence of a man who belongs to himself. His energy neither pushes nor pulls. It simply exists. And that neutrality awakens a deeper admiration than attraction ever could. She understands that the man who governs his inner world does not need to conquer anyone else's. His mere existence invites those around him to align themselves. Machiavelli believed this was the hardest power to maintain, the power that does not impose, does not seek reward. The strong man could return to the game of desire, manipulate, seduce, rebuild his throne, but he has realized that every victory won outside himself is a defeat if it costs him peace. And so he chooses another form of greatness, the greatness of the one who leads without chains. The world tests him in new ways, flattery, criticism, noise, but nothing pulls him off balance because his center is silent. When someone tries to provoke him, he answers with calm. When someone tries to idolize him, he answers with humility. His power no longer reacts, it radiates. And in that radiance lies a message only a few can understand. Absolute control is knowing when not to use it. She, watching from afar, feels something shifting inside her. For the first time, she does not want to possess him. She wants to understand him. And that understanding is love, not desire, because love, in its purest form, does not seek to consume, but to contemplate. The man knows this and does not run. He accepts the feeling without fear because it no longer threatens his equilibrium. He has discovered that sharing his strength does not weaken him, it expands him. Machiavelli would say that power, in its highest form, becomes invisible. It does not show itself, it does not celebrate itself, it simply exists like a natural law. The man who embodies it becomes part of the order of the world. His wisdom leaves traces, not through what he teaches, but through how he lives. And in that way of living, love stops being danger and becomes harmony. Do you feel that stillness that arrives when you understand you no longer need to prove anything? It is the point where power ceases to be struggle and becomes understanding. If you feel it, say it. Recognizing it means entering the territory where the soul and the mind finally become one force. Machiavelli contemplated the final destiny of power, the invisible inheritance it leaves in others. The man who has learned to master himself is no longer just an individual. He is a principle. His life becomes a living lesson for those who watch him without fully knowing why he unsettles them. He does not speak of greatness, but his existence hints at it. And the world, always in search of examples, begins to name him even without words. Wise power does not need history. It seeps into gestures, into glances, into the way one occupies space. Men admire him because something in him defies time. Women look at him with the curiosity of someone who sees reflected in another the balance she always sought. No one can fully explain his influence because it does not impose, it spreads. Machiavelli knew this was the hardest power to describe, the kind that does not rely on force or fear, but on silent example. A man who governs himself leaves an imprint without trying. His calm changes the rhythm of a room. His words end arguments before they begin, not because he intimidates, but because his energy orders. It is the echo of inner mastery projected outward. Those who cross paths with him change without noticing. Some feel peace, others discomfort, others envy, but all remember him. The true legacy of power is not being remembered for deeds, but for the transformation it triggers in those who witness it. Machiavelli saw in him the synthesis of everything he taught: control, temptation overcome, wisdom turned into presence. He had finally become a prince without a crown, the sovereign of himself. And that kind of reign does not die, it multiplies. His ideas, his gestures, his way of seeing the world begin to repeat themselves in others. Without meaning to, he becomes a myth. Yet, myth carries weight. The wise man knows that everything which inspires can also be distorted. Some will try to imitate his calm without understanding it and will turn serenity into arrogance. Others will use his name to justify their own ego. He knows this, but he does not intervene. Because legacy cannot be controlled, only offered. He who tries to protect his own imprint ends up erasing it. Machiavelli watched him walk through a world that could no longer affect him. He did not seek disciples nor admirers. His only purpose was to live according to the truth he had discovered, that power without consciousness destroys, but power united with wisdom elevates. And as he moved forward, he knew others would follow, not because they wanted to be like him, but because seeing him reminded them of what they could become. Do you feel that when you meet someone who radiates peace in the middle of chaos? That sensation is not admiration, it is memory. Memory of your own potential, still asleep. If something in you recognizes it, write where you feel it. Recognizing the reflection is the first step toward becoming what you already sense you are. The world would continue spinning with its noise, ambitions, and passions. But that man no longer belonged to that dance, not because he believed himself superior, but because he had understood the hidden rhythm behind the noise. He knew when to act and when to remain silent, when to advance and when to withdraw. He had turned life into a board where every move had meaning, even those that looked like loss. Machiavelli believed this to be the highest degree of intelligence, to accept the flow of events without losing direction. Power was no longer measured in conquest, but in the ability to remain calm while everything else moves. And the man who achieves this becomes a beacon even without intending to. When she crossed paths with him again, she felt something different. It wasn't the old desire nor the usual curiosity, it was gratitude, because his presence, even without words, had shown her what true mastery means. She no longer needed him, yet she could not forget him. She carried within her the imprint of his serenity, the memory that a love without chains is possible. Machiavelli saw in that final encounter the culmination of all his lessons. Power and tenderness were no longer opposites. In perfect balance, strength becomes soft, and softness becomes powerful. The man who had learned self-control had not turned to stone. He had become light, and light does not dominate, it reveals. From that moment on, everyone who met him carried something of him, a gesture, a phrase, a calm. This is how wise power multiplies, not by decree, but by resonance. It needs no temples, no followers, because its temple lives in every mind it transforms. Legacy is not built with monuments, but with consciousness. Machiavelli would have said that a prince dies twice, once when the body ends and once when his influence is forgotten. But a man who governs his spirit never dies. His influence merges with the air, dissolves into the silent decisions of others. Every time someone chooses calm over impulse, he lives again for a moment. In the end, he left no writings, no speeches. He left an example. And an example born from inner power is stronger than any empire. Those who see it understand that freedom is not doing whatever you want, but not being a slave to what you fear. And that understanding becomes a seed for generations yet to exist. Machiavelli, closing his observation, understood that the man's story did not end with his life. It was only beginning with his silence. Because in the silence of one who has conquered his mind lies the seed of every true revolution. Do you feel it? That calm that settles after understanding everything is not the end. It is the moment the inheritance begins. If you feel it, write it.